A few years ago, right when fall was coming to an end, I decided to take one last camping trip before winter shut everything down. It wasn't something I had planned ahead of time. It was more of an impulse decision. One morning I woke up, checked the weather, and realized I still had a short window before the cold became unbearable. That same day I packed my gear, loaded my car, and drove north toward the forests of Minnesota. I lived a couple of hours south, so this wasn't unfamiliar territory. I'd been camping and hiking in those woods for years. It was my escape whenever I needed to clear my head. Minnesota has thousands of lakes scattered across the northern part of the state, and if you know where to look, you can find smaller, hidden ones that almost nobody visits. That's what I always looked for. I never liked crowded campsites. I preferred places where it felt like the world had gone quiet. The lake I chose this time was one I'd been to before. It was small, tucked away deep in the woods and far from any marked trail. I had camped there multiple times over the years without ever seeing another person. That was part of why it became my go-to spot. The first 3 days of the trip were completely normal, peaceful even. I spent my days walking through the forest, exploring old paths, swimming in the cold water when the sun was out, and sitting by the lake just listening to the wind move through the trees. At night, I'd build a fire, cook something simple, and watch the flames until I got tired. There was nothing unsettling about it. I felt safe, comfortable, alone in the best possible way. That changed on the fourth morning. I woke up just as the sun was starting to rise. The sky was pale orange through the trees, and the air had that sharp fall chill to it. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, stretching and yawning, still half asleep. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were everywhere. At first, my brain didn't fully process what I was seeing. It took a few seconds for reality to sink in. There were boot prints all around my campsite, near the fire pit, along the shoreline, and worst of all, right in front of my tent. They weren't mine. I stood there staring at them, my stomach slowly tightening. The boots were heavy, the kind that leave deep impressions in the dirt. I didn't own boots like that. I was absolutely sure those prints hadn't been there the night before. Someone had walked around my campsite while I was asleep. Someone had come close enough to my tent that if they wanted to, they could have reached out and touched it. I felt exposed in a way I never had before. I spent the entire morning searching the area. I walked through the woods in wide circles. I followed the shoreline. I looked for another campsite, another tent, any sign that someone else was staying nearby. There was nothing. No tracks leading away, no gear, no campfire remains. Nothing that explained why someone would come all the way out here, walk around my campsite in the middle of the night, and then vanish. What bothered me most wasn't just that someone had been there. It was how they'd been there. They didn't show up during the day. They didn't announce themselves. They came while I was asleep, walked around everything I owned, approached my tent, and then left without a trace. It didn't feel random. For a while, I seriously considered packing up and leaving, but I kept talking myself out of it. This was my last camping trip of the year. I didn't want fear to ruin it, and I hadn't seen or heard anything since that morning. Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe someone had stumbled upon the lake at night, realized it wasn't empty, and decided to move on. Creepy, yes, but not necessarily dangerous. That night, I tried to relax. I sat by the fire as the sun went down, listening to the lake gently move against the shore. The woods were calm. The wind rustled the leaves. The fire crackled softly. Slowly, my nerves settled. I leaned back in my chair, zipped up my jacket, and let myself get comfortable. I didn't fully fall asleep. My eyes were closed, my body relaxed, but my mind was still aware of my surroundings. That half-awake state where you're drifting but still conscious. That's when I heard it, a voice calling my name. My eyes snapped open instantly. My heart slammed against my chest as I jerked upright and looked around. The fire was still burning low. The lake looked the same. The trees stood motionless. Everything was quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe I had dreamed it, some strange half-sleep hallucination. I sat there listening, barely breathing. After a minute, I called out, "Hello." My voice echoed across the lake and into the woods. Nothing answered. I tried to calm myself down. I told myself it was just my brain playing tricks on me. Being alone, half asleep after a stressful day, it made sense, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. About half an hour later, while I was fully awake, I heard it again, my name. This time, there was no doubt about it. The voice came from the woods beyond the edge of the firelight. It didn't sound angry. It didn't sound rushed. It sounded calm, almost inviting, like someone asking for help. I stood up slowly and stared into the darkness between the trees. My name was called again, closer. My thoughts were racing. How could a stranger out here know my name? I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I hadn't seen another person in days. Against my better judgment, I took a few steps toward the edge of the light and called out again, my voice shaking slightly. "Hello." There was silence for about 15 seconds, then my name again. That was when something inside me snapped into focus. The way the voice kept repeating my name, the way it never answered my questions. The way it seemed to want me to leave the safety of the fire and walk into pitch black woods, something was very wrong. I backed away and started packing my gear as quietly as I could. My hands were shaking and the fire had burned down to glowing embers, making it harder to see. As I packed, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching leaves somewhere beyond the light. The voice moved closer. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. Once everything was packed, I slung my backpack on and grabbed my flashlight. I thought about turning it on but decided against it. I didn't want to give away my position. I slipped into the darkness and headed in the opposite direction of the voice. As I walked away, I turned back one last time. In the faint glow of the dying fire, I saw a figure standing just beyond it. I couldn't make out his face or clothes, just a shape still, watching. Something about him felt wrong, unnatural. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. Even now, years later, I don't know who that was or how they knew my name. And every time I think about that night, I know one thing for sure. If I had followed that voice into the woods, I never would have come back. I want to stay anonymous, but this happened several years ago, and it's something I still think about more often than I'd like to admit. At the time, I was working at a small standalone business. It wasn't a big office, just a handful of employees, and because of that, everyone knew everyone. A few months after I started working there, a guy named Cameron was hired. We were brought on around the same time, and our desks were right next to each other. We clicked almost immediately. We talked constantly during the workday, sometimes about work, but mostly about random stuff, movies, life, hiking, camping, and being outdoors. We were both really into nature and always joked about how we needed to go on a camping trip someday. It became one of those running jokes you don't really expect to ever turn into reality. We never hung out outside of work, but we talked so much during office hours that it felt like we were actual friends. That's why it caught me completely off guard when I walked into work one morning and noticed Cameron wasn't there. His desk was empty, not messy empty like he stepped away, completely cleared out. No computer, no papers, nothing. It looked like he had never worked there at all. Later that day, I found out he'd been fired. No one would tell me why. Management just said it was an internal issue and left it at that. That same evening, I got a text from Cameron. He asked if I wanted to finally do that camping trip we were always talking about. Looking back, I realize how strange the timing was, but at the time, I honestly felt bad for him. Losing a job like that couldn't have been easy, and I figured if I didn't go, I'd probably never see him again anyway. So I said yes. We made plans and agreed to meet a week later at a forest trailhead about 2 hours west of the city. We were driving separately and meeting there in the morning. When I arrived, Cameron was already there. He looked genuinely happy to see me. He smiled, waved, and acted friendly like always, but something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it. He just didn't have the same energy he did back at the office. He was quieter, more reserved. I brushed it off. We started hiking down the trail toward the campsite, talking the whole way. I tried casually asking about work and why he'd been fired, but every time I brought it up, he dodged the question. At work, he was always an open book, sometimes overly open, so the sudden secrecy felt strange. Eventually, I stopped asking. When we reached the campsite, we set up our tents and made lunch. Everything felt normal enough. We sat and talked for a while, and just as I started to relax, Cameron suddenly stood up. "I'll be right back," he said. Then he walked straight into the woods. The way he said it felt off, like he had somewhere specific to go, not like someone casually going for a walk. I sat there alone for about 10 minutes before he came back. He didn't say anything, didn't explain where he'd gone. He just sat back down and continued the conversation like nothing had happened. I let it go. About an hour later, it happened again. We were in the middle of talking when Cameron suddenly stopped mid-sentence, stared into the trees, stood up, and walked off without a word. That's when I really started feeling uneasy. This time, when he came back, I asked him where he went. He paused for a second like he was thinking, then said, "Nowhere." That was it. No explanation. I didn't push him. I talked to this guy almost every day for 6 months. I didn't want to overreact. That night, we sat around the campfire until it got late and eventually went into our tents. I was tired enough that I fell asleep quickly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I don't know what woke me. There was no loud noise or movement, just a sudden awareness. The forest was incredibly quiet, broken only by distant natural sounds. I unzipped my tent slightly and looked out. Cameron's tent was open. He wasn't inside. I scanned the campsite, expecting to see him nearby, but he was nowhere to be seen. Then I noticed something else. The flashlight was gone. I called out his name softly at first, no answer. I stepped out of my tent and called again, louder this time, still nothing. I stood there listening, my heart starting to beat faster, when I heard something from the woods, voices, two people talking quietly. I froze. "Cameron," I called out again. The voices immediately stopped. The woods went dead silent. After about 30 seconds that felt way longer than it should have, Cameron slowly stepped out of the trees and into the campsite. His face looked tense, but he forced a nervous smile. I asked him who else was out there. He hesitated, then said, "No one." As he said it, I heard footsteps, slow footsteps, coming closer from the darkness. I looked at Cameron again and asked him more urgently this time who was out there. He said, "No one," again. We stood there in silence, staring at each other while the footsteps continued to approach. That's when my body took over. I turned and ran. I didn't grab my gear. I didn't say another word. I just bolted down the trail as fast as I could. As I ran, I heard Cameron's voice behind me and another voice with him, but I never looked back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. Thank God we drove separately. I got inside, locked the doors, and drove straight home. Later that night, I tried texting Cameron. The message didn't even send. He had already blocked me. I've never heard from him again. To this day, I don't know who else was out there or what Cameron was involved in, but I'm convinced that if I hadn't run when I did, this story wouldn't be about a camping trip I'd be missing. This happened last year, right around early November, when I took a trip back to my hometown. The main reason was to visit some old friends, but I also wanted a quiet break from work and life in general. I ended up renting a small vacation cabin in the woods just outside town. Nothing fancy, just a simple place surrounded by trees, with a trail behind it that led deeper into the forest. My hometown isn't very big. It's the kind of place where most of the land is forest and everyone knows everyone. Growing up there, I spent a lot of time around nature, but strangely enough, I'd never actually gone camping before. Over the past year, though, I'd been doing a ton of research and slowly buying gear. I really wanted to get into camping, and this felt like the safest way to start, somewhere familiar, with a solid cabin nearby in case anything went wrong. The plan was simple. I'd stay at the cabin for a few days, catch up with friends, then do a short overnight camping trip at a small campground I'd read about. The trail to it started right behind the cabin and only took about an hour to hike. If anything felt off, I could just turn around and be back at the cabin quickly. The first couple of days went perfectly. I saw friends, relaxed, and spent a full day just organizing my gear and mentally preparing myself. By the time I finally headed out to the campground, I felt ready. At least I thought I did. The trail itself was quiet and narrow, winding through thick trees. For the first 10 minutes, I was mostly distracted with adjusting my backpack straps and making sure everything felt comfortable. Once I settled into a steady pace, that's when the feeling started, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. At first, I brushed it off. This was my first time alone in a forest like this. Of course, I was nervous, but the feeling didn't fade. Every time I glanced into the trees beside the trail, my stomach tightened. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like a deep, hollow dread. I kept telling myself to stop being dramatic and pushed forward. When I reached the campsite, I felt a bit better. It wasn't much, just a small clearing off the trail with a few scraps left behind by previous campers and a crude fire ring. It didn't look well maintained at all, but being off the trail and in an open space gave me a false sense of security. I started setting up my tent, carefully following the instructions since it was my first time. It took me about 50 minutes, and just as I was putting the rain cover over it, someone stepped into the clearing. A man. He was tall and looked to be around my age, maybe mid-20s. When I looked up at him, he waved and smiled, but the smile was wrong. His mouth smiled, but the rest of his face didn't move. No warmth, no friendliness, just teeth. I told myself I was overthinking it. It was probably just an awkward coincidence that someone else showed up at the same time. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. He set up his tent not too far from mine. That's when I noticed something else strange. That was all he brought. No sleeping bag, no food, no extra gear. His tent was mostly mesh, completely see-through, and he didn't even put a rain cover on it. He just sat there afterward, doing nothing. Every time I glanced over, he was already looking at me. As the sun started dipping lower, my discomfort grew into full-blown fear. I couldn't explain it logically, but everything in me screamed that something was wrong. I hated the idea of giving up so quickly, but staying there alone with him overnight felt like a huge mistake. I decided to leave. The moment I started packing, the man stood up. He didn't say anything. He just watched me. His smile was gone now. His face looked irritated, almost annoyed. I rushed, shoving everything into my backpack without organizing it. By the time I zipped it up, the sun was nearly gone. I started down the trail, constantly checking behind me. For the first few minutes, I felt relief. The trail was empty. Then about 10 minutes in, I looked back again. He was there, far behind me, partially obscured by trees, walking in my direction. My body went cold. I picked up my pace, trying not to panic. I don't think he realized I'd seen him. The fading light actually worked in my favor, and I made it back to the rental cabin just as darkness settled in. I slammed the door shut, locked everything, and stood frozen, listening. For 15 minutes, nothing happened. I was staring out the back window when a loud knock exploded against the front door. Not a polite knock, not curious, violent pounding. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. As soon as I started talking, the pounding stopped. I heard footsteps circling the cabin, then thumps against the windows, and then silence. The officers arrived about 20 minutes later. After hearing everything, they told me I did the right thing by leaving when I did. They searched the area but never found him. When they checked the campsite, his tent was gone. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed. I only know that the moment I ignored my gut was the moment everything started going wrong, and I won't ever make that mistake again.